to my series on Pirkei Avot. Pirkei Avot, the chapters of the Fathers, is the distillation of thousands of years of Jewish wisdom that was eventually written down around the year 200 CE. And we're going to start today with chapter 1, verse 1 of this book of the Mishnah. It begins, Moshe kibel Torah miSinai umasra leYehoshua. Moses received the Torah at Sinai, and he handed on the Torah to Joshua. From Joshua to the elders, from the elders to the prophets, from the prophets, they passed it on to the members of the Great Knesset, the original Great Knesset during the First Temple period of 120 elders. This was a predecessor to the Sanhedrin. And that gets us down to when they actually start telling us things that are more important. So the real question we have to ask first is, why does this book of distilled wisdom start with essentially telling us the chain of transmission of the Torah, the oral Torah in this case? Well, the source of authority for the Torah doesn't come from an intellectual argument. It doesn't come from an argument that, well, you see this and that, and therefore that means that this must be. We derive all those things post facto. The tradition in Judaism, its authority comes from the tradition itself, that we believe there is an unbroken chain of tradition all the way from the day Moses stood at Mount Sinai until our day. This text brings us from Mount Sinai up until the time that the Mishnah was written down. And from that time on, we are teaching and continuing those teachings that are written in the Mishnah. Therefore, our traditions today are a continuation of the ancient traditions that those rabbis had already from Moses at Sinai. And now we get into some of the actual content, where as we go forward, each sort of generation of scholars throughout, especially the first chapter here, will go from generation to generation, and each generation will sort of give over one or two core concepts that really distill the key wisdom that they learned from their entire worldview, from a lifetime of study and experience. Hem amru shlosha dvarim. They said three things. Be moderate in judgment, measured, maybe is a better word. Teach many students, and create a fence for the Torah. So throughout this series, I'm going to be relying on the RAMBAM, Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon's commentary on Pirkei Avot, because he gives a very complete and relatively simple to understand commentary without going too deep into sort of mystical aspects of things. And I think that's going to be the most useful for us. So when we go to the RAMBAM, he breaks down each of these categories. One is to be measured in judgment, have many students, and build a fence around the Torah. Now, what exactly do those mean? So, to have many students, that's obvious. That makes sense. You want to carry on a tradition, you have to teach a lot of people that tradition. Just like if you want to carry on a tradition of Western literature, you have to teach it to lots of students in universities, and then therefore they will continue it on to the following generation. That's obvious. So he says about to be measured in judgment. So the Rambam, he doesn't really explain something we didn't understand before, but he says this means specifically take your time in making these decisions until you can really understand deeply what you're doing, and things that didn't occur to you at first will come up as you think about them. So he's talking about deliberate judgment, taking your time, slowly thinking things through, and then deciding what to do. And to make a fence for the Torah, this refers to the rules and laws that the rabbis make around the Torah laws to help us prevent ourselves from transgressing. So, for example, there are many things we're not allowed to do on the Sabbath, on Shabbat. There are actually 39 categories of things, and each of those things is a biblical prohibition. But for instance, you're not allowed to build a raft. You're not allowed to build things on Shabbat. But because the rabbis were afraid you might build a raft to keep yourself afloat if you want to go swimming in the ocean, and also remember that most people didn't know how to swim back in the day, so that you might build a raft if you want to go hang out in the water. So therefore they just forbade going in the water. Or For instance, it was a normal thing that if you were riding a horse, you might break off a branch from a tree that you're passing by to use to whip it with, to hit it with. Don't worry, animal lovers. You don't have to hit it too hard that it actually hurts, but just sometimes your hand isn't strong enough to make it move. So you might break off this stick. So therefore, the rabbi said, no riding a horse on Shabbat. That's a fence around the Torah. They're worried that you might come accidentally to break a law of the Torah just by way of doing normal everyday things, which are permitted technically on Shabbat, but the rabbis make them forbidden so that you won't accidentally come to transgress an actual biblical prohibition, which only makes sense if you actually take the idea of these biblical prohibitions extremely seriously. Breaking Shabbat is a capital offense. It's an extremely important law. So the rabbis made lots of fences around those laws to make sure you wouldn't step over. Just like if you go to the top of the Empire State Building, or no, I think that's enclosed. Say, well, whatever, you go to the top of a big building that's where you can look out over and it's open, there's still going to be some sort of fence there, some sort of barrier, lest you fall over the edge. And that's the idea about building a fence around the Torah. So altogether, we have three things which really are dedicated to continuing the tradition. You're going to have lots of students who will carry it on. You're going to be deliberate in your judgments so that the judgments you make and you pass on will be correct and will be reasonable. And you're going to create fences to keep the people, sort of public policy, as far away as you deem necessary from the actual biblical prohibition itself. And that's all for the first chapter.